Joe, it's good to see you, man. It's been too long. I know you've been, had a lot going on. Excited for your book, excited for the opportunity to chat with you today. Thanks for being here, man.
I'm so excited to hang out with you. You're just such an awesome person to hang out with. And every time we hang out, we have a good time.
Yeah, for those listening in, Joe and I got to know each other through a group that we're a part of called Front Row Dads. It's got a litany of just really amazing guys, and that's how we've got to know each other over the last couple of years. I will say this as well, just a little plug to Practice of the Practice. Joe and his organization, they produce, and his team produces all of these podcasts. So if you enjoy listening in, it is because of them, Sam, Elizabeth, and the whole rest of the crew that makes it happen. And thank you for that. But let's talk about your book, man. I'm excited. It's fun as we start building a relationship. You were kind of on the heels of really selling the book, and then kind of had all the framework and everything built out. I know a big part of writing it, so I kind of feel like I've walked with you through a certain part of this book, and it's exciting that it's finally coming out. Excited for people to see it, but one of the things we were just mentioning as we were catching up is how timely this idea that Thursday is the new Friday, this altering of the work week per se. So, I'd just love to know kind of in your mind how it's kind of framing in. It's like, holy cow, here we are in 2021, what work-life culture means, and your book is coming out, and how you really feel you can help people.
Yeah, I mean, I really feel like there should be an asterisk that says this book's sponsored by COVID, because it's like there could not have been a better time to say, let's rethink how we work. Even though I started writing this and kind of bringing it together in 2018, and really it's been work that I've been doing for over 20 years. But the idea of we are the post-pandemic generation, and we get to decide what happens moving forward. And we really have a window of time to say, what do we want? And I know you want to dig into the history, and I love the history of kind of the work week and time and all of that. But just start with, we just went through a global experiment in 2020 to say, do we need to work the way that we've been working? Or might there be other paths we could take that are healthier, that make us happier, that maybe we see that how we were judging productivity wasn't even right, and that maybe there might be different ways to do it. You just hear of all these different stories from the pandemic coming out of people that worked 2 full-time jobs and were able to do that in 40 or 50 hours a week because of how many inefficiencies there were in each of these full-time jobs. And just things like that, where these global experiments were happening out of need, not because companies were saying we need to experiment with the work week, but because we were in lockdown. And so it's really timely to see this book coming out now to say there's actually a framework, and there's actually research that supports a lot of the things we intuitively experienced over the last 18 months. Yeah,
I mean, just to get into that, I think it's so you were in this. It's really truly diabolical, is what I would call the description of it, because we have people that are like, no, we have to be back in the office because that's the only thing that's going to create normalcy, as opposed to others. I'm like, well, we made it work. Our business either survived or thrived in a lot of cases. So why do we have to now go back to what we were doing before? Let's really look at that from an experimentation, a trial and error point of view, and let's see all those inefficiencies that were there. And it's these two diabolical camps in leadership and management. And to me, as you and I wrote down, this post-pandemic leadership generation is how are we going to embrace that? And, as this is a podcast for leaders and leadership, dude, that's spot on. So
yeah, I mean, to me,
let's
just name this idea of going back to work how it was. I mean, that is the industrialist mindset. And so if we just go back a little bit in history to understand how did we get here? Because whenever I talk to leaders and I'm saying, here's where your organization wants to go, we have to understand where that organization has been. Where has that industry been? How did we even get here? And so if we're talking about time and the construction of work within that time, we really have to understand, how did we get here to where we have the 40-hour work week, that we're told we need to sit in chairs, that's the biggest KPI productivity measure. So let's go back a little bit. So let's go back 4,000 years to the Babylonians. So the Babylonians,
that's just a little bit,
back a skosh,
just a little bit,
just a little nibble. So let's go back to the Babylonians. When they looked up in the sky, they saw 7 major astrological things. They saw the sun, the moon, Earth, Venus, Mercury, Mars, and Jupiter. So they said, we should have a 7-day week. When the Jews were in exile in Babylon, that's when the Torah was written down. And as a way to say the early myths of the Babylonians, which were very violent, let's write down the way that we see creation. So a 7-day week, following that Babylonian framework, but then saying that it's good, it's interesting, that all these things that we see in Genesis. And so the idea of the 7-day week starts in Babylon. The Egyptians, they had an 8-day week. The Romans had a 10-day week. It wasn't until the Roman emperor in around 300 converted to Christianity that the 7-day week spread across the Roman Empire and really took off as the type of week across the globe. We could just as easily have a 5-day week with 73 weeks in a year. So, I mean, if we just start with, we made this up, it's totally random, that helps us say, whoa, let's step back a bit. Do we want this to continue? And when we really think about it, the 7-day week doesn't make sense.
Wait a second. You just moved my cheese. And hopefully you guys listening in, Joe, I hope you're not offended by that because I want to dig deeper.
That's a great book.
We have enough relationship where you can call me out and it's just kind of like, wait a second, we can create whatever we want to? Like, you can't do that for people. We have to mimic what was before us because that's where we only find comfort, right?
Well, I think it is where we often find comfort, that our brain wants to do what we've always done. But when we slow down, that's where we can do new things. That's where we can understand new things. That when we're stressed out and maxed out, our brains don't do new things. One thing I talk about in the book was when I was in Nepal. It was between my undergraduate and my graduate work. I'm at the edge of the Chitwan jungle with my friend Todd, and our guide says to us, if we get chased by a wild rhinoceros, run up a tree. Now, in life, there's lots of times you should ask follow-up questions, which I did not ask. I didn't say, what kind of tree? How often does this happen? Is this once a year? Is it every week? Like, how often are you getting chased by rhinos? Can we practice a little bit? So didn't do any of that. So we enter the jungle. We're in there for about an hour. And then we see a rhino. And this is 2001. I don't have a digital camera. I have one of those film cameras. You take a picture. You have no idea. You got to send it in to see the pictures. I have no idea if this turns out. So I take a step towards the rhino, take another picture. And this is the point that I should have said, this is good enough. But I did not, because I'm Joe Sanok. So I take another step towards the rhino. This rhino charges our group. It's me, my friend Todd, our guides, and a couple Peace Corps volunteers. I take off running because I know, because I was in track with Todd, that I can outrun him for about 200 yards. But he's a long distance runner, so he's got me past that. So for 200 yards, I have him as a human shield and 2 other people. So we run, don't hear the rhino anymore, come back. Our guide comes down the tree and yells at us, why didn't you run up the tree? So why didn't I run up the tree? Because my brain was stressed out and maxed out. I'm not going to try something new when I'm freaking out. I'm going to go with the old. I'm going to go with what's been handed to me. I know I can outrun Todd and these Peace Corps volunteers, so I'm going to do that, even if it's the dumber decision compared to climbing a tree. So we see that over and over, we just accept what's inherited. We just accept what people have given us, and we go to that as a default because we're stressed out and maxed out. And so if we then fast forward from those Babylonians to the late 1800s, early 1900s, it's crazy what we look at the work week being back then. It was 10 to 14-hour days, 6 to 7 days a week. I mean, it was a farmer's schedule. I mean, you know farming, Tyler. Like, you're working all the time. You don't take any breaks. I mean, you can't just be like, sorry, cows, you don't get to eat today. You've got to actually keep working. And so when Henry Ford in 1926 then institutes the 40-hour work week, it's a huge step for the evolution of business and the evolution of humanity in so many ways. But honestly, it was a selfish decision. He's been quoted numerous times saying that he knew people would not buy a car to get to work faster. But if they had a weekend, if they had something fun to go do, they would buy a car to do more of that on the weekend. So it was to sell more cars to his own people. So again, we see that just like the 7-day week, that the 40-hour work week less than 100 years ago was handed to us and is completely arbitrary by a power broker.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I want to stop and think about is you mentioned this idea of work pre-industrial where it was like, again, you have horses, you have animals. You're doing that 7 days a week. As a parent, you're doing that 7 days a week. However, I know from being on a farm, there were days that, yes, we had to do the necessities, but we didn't do extras. We found out, hey, how can we, in some ways rest? Because there was nothing that you could ever get away from. It was constant. But when we get into these situations where, it starts to take a toll, how does that kind of fit into this idea of Thursday is the new Friday, this idea of let's look at how we work. Where is it taking the toll, and how does all of a sudden that production is no longer linear? Meaning if I put in 1 hour work, I yield this. If I put in 2 hours of work, well, I must yield 2x. That doesn't happen. And, kind of walk us through in the research what you've seen in your professional life as a therapist, how you've seen that toll take and where that breaking point is.
Yeah, I think intuitively we know this. Like if I said, are you more productive on a Friday afternoon at 3 or a Monday morning at 8? Like most people would say if they're in a traditional job, yeah, Friday afternoon's a blow off. It's a half-lived day. We don't get as much done. But the research actually supports that when we are burned out, that you're right, that working twice as many hours does not mean twice as much productivity. That actually, when we slow down, we can find that we can unleash some different things. And so a couple factors around just the data and the science. There's a 30-year study that I talk about in the book where they looked at health outcomes. And every single year, they're looking at these people from the study of if they're happier than the year before, if they're healthier. Over and over, we see that right now people are underslept. They're more unhealthy. They have less time outside. They feel like their life is not headed in a positive direction. It's an all-time high in all of these different outcomes. And actually, within the pandemic, there was a research study that was done. They found that people were actually happier during the pandemic because they didn't feel like there was this much work pressure. They were more satisfied with their jobs overall. Now, of course, there were people that had very tough jobs, frontline workers, all of those. But if we just look at the data, overall, people were actually happier because they didn't have that commute. They were able to just make their lunch and eat with their kids. They were able to manage their own schedule in a way that was much different than often the micromanaging we see of the industrialists. And so there's so much opportunity here when we look at the data to say we're really doing a poor job at making life just happy for ourselves, satisfactory, doing work that we feel really contributes to the world. Let's just pause for a second and say, do we want to keep doing this? Because we have this opportunity post-pandemic to then say, how am I going to run my business? Or how am I going to lead this business that I've been called into to lead? Is it going to be the old way? Or do we need to do some experiments and walk through some particular steps to say, how do we then enact change as leaders with research, with experiments that actually is shown to help people get more done and be more creative?
It's really embracing. And, I'm just finishing up the book, Help I Work With People by Chad Veach. And he talks about this idea of reframing failure as just trial and error. We all love trial and error. It's like, we can accept trial and error. So if, as a leader, I'm looking at it and saying, okay, well, let's go into this post-pandemic work period, all right? And we have this information that Joe's sharing with us, and we've seen what's happened. Well, let's just trial and error. Let's see if, we'll do 1 day a week that we're back together, and then it's a free schedule otherwise, however that may be for whatever works in your place, and trial and error it. And one of the things that, previous this year, one of the authors I had, which I love it because it coincides with your book. It was Michael Hyatt's Win at Work, Succeed at Life. And this idea that, hey, they went to a 30-hour work week and they said, let's measure productivity. And they never saw any dip. And a lot of that was instituted kind of this pandemic that we recognized families had higher responsibilities. So to kind of segue into that, this whole trial and error, we talk about that. If we're an empathetic leader and we understand that the conditions of the workplace have changed, don't we need to be more empathetic to the people there at the office and understand that maybe they aren't able to be here from 7 to 5 with 0 other family obligations? Maybe it's shared parenting. Maybe, they're involved in their kids' lives. Otherwise, they need to leave at 3 to be able to pick up their kids. How much do all those things fit into really differences now compared to what it was 100 years ago?
Yeah, I think what you're tapping into is really the shift from the industrialists who thought about people as parts of a machine to really an evolutionary model where we're looking at our staff and saying that they have a lot of responsibilities. There's nuance. We want still this bottom line productivity, but also we understand that's not going to come in doing it the old way. And so this global shift towards an evolutionary model of business is really what we're talking about, that compared to this old model of the industrialists. So effective leaders are doing a number of things. They're starting with their internal inclinations. So there's 3 inclinations that research shows that natural leaders have. Now, within the book, I have an assessment to just figure out your baseline. This doesn't mean if you don't have it that you're not going to be a good leader. It just means that you recognize, okay, this area needs some development. And here's some skills that I'm going to give you that the research supports will actually help you be a better leader. So the first one is curiosity. And that's similar to what you're talking about. That effective leaders start with being curious. That they say, well, that's really interesting what just happened. Instead of, oh, we're such a failure, or they wait for a eureka moment. They just keep saying, well, that's interesting. That's interesting. We just did this huge Facebook ads campaign and, we spent all this money and nothing happened. What is going on there? Let's get some data. Let's pull that. Let's see what we did wrong and what we can learn from. The second one is having an outsider's perspective. And sometimes leaders allow themselves to be too internal than they should be. There's actually a really interesting study. It was called the color study. And so they brought together groups of people around, 8 or so people. And they would show a color. It was either green or it was blue. And the people would say, oh, that's green, that's blue, that's blue, that's green. There were some colors that were a little closer, some were more pronounced. For the most part, in the first part of the study, people agreed. In the second part of the study, they brought in 2 outsiders that were participating with the researchers. And there were specific colors that they would say that's green when it was clearly blue, or blue when that's clearly green. And they were able to show that outsiders actually statistically had more influence over the group than they should have. That they should not have had the influence that they had. And there's study after study that does different variations of this, showing that outsiders actually have more ways that they can influence the group than the insiders. And so even if you think about when you've come in as a new leader to a new organization, and you're like, why do they have these systems? Why do they do things this way? And people are like, I've never thought of that. We just do it. We have this, random way that we do it. That outsider actually comes in and can point things out that an insider often can't. And so developing those skills as a leader is so important. Then the third area is an ability to move on it. If we think about a spectrum of speed on one side and accuracy on the other. So there are lots of times in life that I want accuracy. If I go into surgery and my doctor, she puts me under, she can take as long as she wants. Be accurate with whenever you're cutting me open. But most of what we do in business and leadership, speed is going to trump accuracy 9 times out of 10. Because then we get that information, then we get things out there. We're not paralyzed by perfection. And we're also not overthinking things and feeling like an imposter. And so effective leaders will then move into that inclination of having that speed over accuracy and the ability to move on it.
Well, I think that last part, as I think about that, it's, as a leader, we have to be willing to be wrong. And that shouldn't be an indictment on our character. To me, I believe it's an indictment on our character if we don't admit when we're wrong. But if we're willing to try something and then be wrong and say, hey, well, the reason we made that decision is we made the decision with the best information we had possible. So we're talking about, culturally, as a leader, I'm leading this organization, I'm leading others, and I'm like, I want you to live a fuller life. I want you to, be able to enjoy what you have going on, because I know if you do that, you're going to bring those ideas into our company, that outsider's perspective, because you're invested in, as opposed to blinders and you can't see anything. But then be willing to say, hey, some of that's going to work, some it's not going to work. And that willingness, I think you just really described to your point earlier, this healthy organization. This healthy leadership. And, I believe, and it's kind of, my purpose is to help other leaders get healthy too. That's my desire in this podcast. It's something we're never going to fully accomplish. I realize that we're always going to have every day this idea that we're going to have to be healthy. And I think if from a leadership perspective, we think about a business, that if we create this work structure, and we can just create it. And today is, when we're recording, it's September 1st. And if we record it today, we set that structure today, it's going to be great for millennia. Well, no, it's not. If some new information comes tomorrow and it's like, oh, well, we need to adjust as opposed to being so held into it. And I think that's what you're kind of really alerting to people is like, historically, it hasn't always been this way. So why do we feel today as a leader we'd be wrong if we were to adjust and change it?
Yeah, even just thinking about that idea of I want to have a process that I can set it and forget it. That is such an industrialist way of thinking about it, that we're going to just set up this machine. It's going to keep kicking out Model Ts, and the people are just going to be parts of that machine. Think about evolution. We see less kids having wisdom teeth over, even just 5 generations. 5 generations ago, people had 2 wisdom teeth. It was just filling their mouth. We don't need that level of teeth in our mouth. Does that mean that nature or our bodies were wrong 5 generations ago? No, it means that people needed more teeth back then. And my daughter, who's getting orthodontic work, doesn't need that many teeth. Like, she just doesn't need them for what our diets are now and the way that we cook and all these different things. Does that mean that because we changed that we're wrong? No, it means that there's an evolutionary model. And so when we go back to that evolutionary model versus that industrialist model in business, what does that look like on a practical level? Well, it means that feedback and change and adaptation is the primary conversation on an ongoing basis. And so, for example, if there's something that goes wrong, like just the other day, I had a podcaster who booked 2 different times for me, one at 10 a.m. and one at 12:30. And the 10 a.m., I'm texting the guy. I'm like, hey, it's 10:05, just making sure you're not having any login problems. And he had got 2 messages that said we're meeting at 10 and one at 12:30, and he just didn't check. So I then, after that show, I texted my assistant. She's my director of details. And I just said, hey, Jess, I just wanted to let you know that I noticed that this guy did this twice. There was confusion. We didn't have as long of an interview because of it. Like, she knows that when I give that feedback, it doesn't mean that she did anything wrong. It means I'm observing the fact that this messed up my schedule, and that we could have had another podcaster in there at the 12:30 mark, but a couple hours before, we're not going to get somebody in there. So let's then change that on Sundays, when you look at my calendar for the week, if you see any double bookings, will you just clarify with people that they need 2 bookings instead of just the one that they probably should have? So then over time, we're getting smarter. Even she checks my emails. So if I BCC her on a reply, she knows that means that she could have replied to that. And she needs to add that reply to the reply library. And so over time, she's getting feedback to do her job better. And it's not that annual review when I sit down and I dump all the stuff that she needs to change on her.
Yeah.
It's this week, here's a small step. And if you do 5 or so small pieces of feedback every single week for 50 weeks a year, I mean, that's 250 pieces of feedback that have adjusted and changed over time, instead of just once a year doing this big drop of all the feedback that person is supposed to get.
Yeah. It's the 1% rule actually played out in life, in business, in the fact that you're making that 1% incremental change. And my opinion there is that's how you find those efficiencies. That's how you find out. It was, my wife and I, we were visiting with some friends, and this friend was telling me he had somebody new join their office, and it was like a Thursday afternoon. It was 2:00, and they'd really crammed out a lot of things in his onboarding process. And he's like, well, I'm not really sure what to do. I'm new here. And he's like, go home. You have a daughter that probably loved to see you. Go play with her. It's a beautiful day. And the guy was just like, how could I do that? I haven't put in my hours. And he's like, it doesn't matter. And, as he and I were talking about that, in this idea that I've learned is he's going to go home with his daughter and he's going to enjoy that time. And also he's going to start thinking about new creative ways to do his new job. Because now he's freed up to think, as opposed to being in an office in these 4 walls and just be like, well, I'm staring at my computer screen. Something magically has to appear. And I think as you bring that up with your experience with Jess of leading people to see that, that's a leadership opportunity that comes of it. What other leadership opportunities are you seeing that if, as a leader, I embrace this idea of really shifting the work week to what fits our schedule? What challenges do they need to be aware of that they need to help people start to process through?
Yeah, I think naturally the average person, they want to do a good job, but they need that coaching and that leadership to do that job well. And they also need that leader to say, please go take a break. Here are the hard boundaries and soft boundaries. So when we think about effective teams that are implementing this 4-day work week, oftentimes it's a small team that has the support of a supervisor. They read through the book. They understand kind of the concepts that really slowing down is the first step. And so one of the key things that most people miss when they want to do these productivity items is they start with the productivity instead of starting with the slowing down. And so for a team to even say, what is the culture within our 6 to 8 person team? So are we going to expect people to catch up on email after their kids go to bed? Are we going to expect people to catch up on their email on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday? If people are on vacation, do they need to be on call? So saying, what are our cultural norms within this small group within the company? Because it only only takes one person to send an email on Wednesday night at 10 o'clock, and then someone else replies, and then everyone else feels like they're out of the loop the next morning. And then people are like, oh, I guess I'm supposed to be checking my email again. Like, we don't want to look bad in front of our peers. And so having that cultural norm of how we slow down is a conversation we rarely have in the office. And so then even being able to say, what are the hard boundaries and what are the soft boundaries? So, for example, I wrote a book about not working on Friday. So I'm not going to take on a consulting client that wants to meet with me on Friday. That is a hard boundary. If they're talking to Jess and they're like, you know what, Friday's my only day, Jess is going to say, you know what, Joe's not your guy. I just don't care. Like, I'm not going to give up a day, to do that. Unless they're like, I'll give you your annual income to work on Friday. Then I'll make, Friday the new Monday, and then I'll take 6 days off. but it's
let's be right, because you can be flexible and change at any given point, right?
Yeah.
There's new information comes along, just be willing to change.
But then there's soft boundaries where, say you have an IT team. If someone gets locked out with their password, they probably need their help getting, in. So we have to troubleshoot that ahead of time and say, okay, maybe we need someone on call. And, every fifth Friday, you have to work on that Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Just figuring out those problems ahead of time. And then on the first work day of the week, to reflect on how did that slowing down go? To have that conversation of, I think we did a really good job. No one was emailing after hours. No one was emailing on Friday. Or, you know what, Jim? I got the email on Wednesday and I felt super out of the loop Thursday. I need to give you feedback that if this is going to be our culture, we need to all follow that. Or maybe it's not our culture. Maybe we realize that Jim did need to send that email on Wednesday evening, and that was essential, and we need to now change our soft boundaries. And so then, again, it's moving, it's changing as you go. And then looking at the key performance indicators. So how are you judging this team to know if 4 days is as effective as 5 days? And so what are the 2, maybe 3 different indicators that you can look at weekly and say, this is up 2%, this is down 1%. What are we going to do to change this? And to know that we're going to run full tilt in this experiment for 2 to 3 months. And then at the end of it, do a 360 review and just say, hey, how did this go? Did we like this experiment? Were we happier? What's the qualitative data that we can say, you know what, I started going out on dates with my wife on a Thursday night again, and honestly, my life just feels happier because of not having to work on Friday. To be able to report out that as well as the data from the KPIs, then you have some things to point to when the higher ups or when other leaders are saying, why are you doing a 4-day week? To really say, here's the effectiveness. We're actually a better team because of this. We had these creative things that came out of it. And our staff are saying they want to stay here forever. Just the retention standpoint could be a game changer for most organizations.
Yeah, and I think that starts into this conversation of, virtual compared to in-person places. Like, how do you ebb and flow that with some virtual? And you know what? Hey, this idea, and it's funny for me because I only a short period of my career did I actually have an office that I had to report to. For the greater majority of my career, I've made my office times. I've managed that. And so this idea that I have to be in office is more foreign than it is similar. And I think when you start to talk to people that have worked in sales, have worked in remote offices, they're like, well, I can manage this. This is, judge me based upon, am I meeting the expectations? But let's have that daily and not yearly so I can guide me through that. And everything you were saying, this idea of how that leader is guiding people through it. And it's an active leadership. It's an active guiding to say, calling people out on Monday. It's not aggressive. It's just like, hey, okay, we saw an email that came through at 10 o'clock on Wednesday. Was that something that was urgent at the moment? Or like, hey, Ben, guess what, dude? I don't want you doing that. It's not because I don't want you to handle the work. It's I want you to be resting. I want you to be thinking about your family and not worrying about it. If it was life or death, great. Thank you for handling it. If it's not life or death, let's handle it in the morning. And I think some of that encouragement from a leadership perspective is displaying healthy empathy to say, I care more about you and your holistic person than I do you filling in the boxes of, what industrial work you need to do. Because at the end of the day, if you're not healthy as a leader, then you're not going to be here long. And that's going to cost us more as an organization than if we, start to have these guiding principles and values that are important to us long term.
100%. And I would actually say that when we look at the challenge of people like you and myself that are entrepreneurs, that we've made our own schedule for so long, the challenge for us is a little different than the typical kind of structured organization. We're doing work that for the most part, we really enjoy. And so to turn that brain off and to really say, I need to set some hard boundaries for myself, because how am I going to capture these good ideas when I'm playing Barbies with my daughters? It's like, well, okay, I need to find a way that I can capture that idea quickly and then get back into the time that I'm spending with my family. So that could be a note on my phone. That could be, putting a reminder in my calendar. It could just be saying, Siri, remind me of this later. Because we do have those ideas as entrepreneurs that are really good ideas that come at really unfortunate times. But what we do is, we're there playing with our kids and we're hashing through an entire e-course or a whole new podcast, and we need to actually take that idea, set it aside, say there is an appropriate time for that. We will have time to come and kill it and just go after that. But right now is not that time. So how do we capture that, give enough information for our future self to look at that note and say, okay, I remember that. Now let's go. You're then going to be more refreshed and more creative going into that than if you're playing with your kids and thinking about all these other things and you're on cloud nine away from them.
Yeah, totally. And it's really practicing intentional presence. And it is this idea. And I think that's where part of this comes down to: the more intentionally present we are as leaders, as family members, as everything, the more productive we are. We can accomplish less and more when we're intentionally present. And, that's kind of a highlight that I see in here. And it's this idea of what is that guiding force? Because this is one of the things that I've learned from a leadership perspective. And I believe this is, if we don't have these values that we adhere to, then we just run amok. It's kind of like the river that doesn't have, hard banks. It all of a sudden just dissipates everywhere. But if you put in hard banks, even if that river's narrower, it's going to be way more efficient, way more productive, because those hard banks are there. And it's like, what are we doing to create those?
And I think that, that idea of, so we've slowed down. What do we do now? How do we make sure we get the most out of our time? There's a couple concepts that we want to kind of point to. So one of them is called Parkinson's law. We've heard it a lot in business, that work expands to the time given. But let's talk about why that works. So you've got a 5-day week, you reduce to a 4-day. Say you had 20 really important tasks to get done in that week. Are you going to get the worst 15 done or the best 15? You're going to do the best work and you're going to drop the ball in other areas. And so it's good to drop the ball, especially early on, because that gives you information on, I probably shouldn't be doing that stuff anyway. I should either just eliminate it from my schedule. I should outsource it to somebody. I should find a software as a service to automate that. Maybe it's time to hire a bookkeeper because you just dread looking at your numbers. Okay. If once every other month your bookkeeper says, here's the trends I see, and that's good enough for you, that's good enough for you. And so if we do that, that's really helpful. So then when we're actually doing the work, we want to make sure that we're using the neuroscience to help us get more done. So one example is that on Thursdays, when I would do my sprints for writing this book, there's a few things that I would do. So first, I would protect my brain the morning that I was writing. I wouldn't read the news, wouldn't look at text, wouldn't look at email. I would show up with a clean brain as much as I could. I would have my healthy breakfast. I'd have my green tea and some coffee. I would be all set. I would give my kids hugs and say, Daddy's off to work, which they knew, don't open that door. Dad is in monk mode. And so they then knew the boundary. So then I did a few things here that triggered my brain to get into a flow state quicker. And so I moved the lights around every single time. I had different lighting. So my eyes were seeing something different. I physically sat in a different chair. I moved my chair to a different part of the room. I had specific headphones that I only wore during this time while I was writing, and listened to a playlist that I only listened to while I was writing. And so all of that allowed my brain to jump quickly back into what I was doing the week before. Rather than having this 45-minute or 60-minute startup, it just jumped right back in, because our brains are really old. They have not caught up to the technology. So we can trick them to do things that is based on evolution, instead of just saying like, oh, there's a white screen, I guess I should start typing. No, let's do some things that actually makes it so you can jump right back into where you were a week ago, and your brain is just on fire to get things done.
It really is a this idea of thinking chair and this thinking place. And it's, again, this idea of being productive in less time. It's find those hacks. One of the things that, I can't help but think about in this idea of, especially people that want to challenge this high amount of hustle, like it's working 20 hours a day, 7 days a week to get ahead. And my point on there is like, where are you getting to? If that's what your desire is for life, then that's not a life I want to sign up for, because there's no allotted number of days that I'm going to have that all of a sudden I know if I maximize in, what I'm doing in 5,000 days, I just don't know. So I need to be intentional and take advantage of what I have. But I also believe by my values and faith that, again, this idea of this Parkinson's law, that it's going to accomplish more. And I think of a business like Chick-fil-A, who's been challenged time and time and time again. Oh, you need to be open 7 days. You'd have, 13% more revenue. You'd be so much better off. And they're like, no, that's not our values. That's not our vision. We're going to hold on to this. And per location, per square foot, they continue to outpace their competitors the whole time along, because they're so rigid with saying, no, this is why we're doing it. This is what we're doing it for. This is what our beliefs are. That, again, I think people really are embraced by that. They're like, I would rather be a part of something that has those values and standards, as opposed to it's just kind of all over the place.
Yeah.
Getting back to this, I was just going to layer in, getting back to this idea that I'm a person, not just a widget.
Absolutely. And that 20-hour-a-day person, that hashtag hustle culture bro, are they really getting that much more done in their extra 10 hours? No, they're probably limping along. They're probably daydreaming. They're taking that time off anyway without realizing they're taking the time off. Or they're drinking all these energy drinks just to keep going outside the pace of their body, and they're going to burn out within a couple years instead of having something that lasts a lifetime. And so that's where, when we really start to look at people's, especially their sprint types, similar to personality types, the research is showing that when you're going to sprint, a lot of times people don't do it right. They hear batching or sprinting. Oh, I should just do a 20-minute sprint. But they don't really know what their actual sprint type is for their brains. And when we can discover your sprint type, it's really helpful to say, okay, I am going to work like crazy right now, and here's how I'm going to do it so it matches my brain. So I'd love to walk through those sprint types to just kind of show kind of what that is. So
let's do it.
So first, it's kind of what you're working on. And so for a time block sprinter, this is someone that works on one particular task over a period of time. So when I was writing the book every Thursday, I was a time block sprinter. I was only working on aspects of the book during that time. When I'm doing a bunch of podcast guesting, I'm time block sprinting. Now, on the other side, we have task switch sprinters. And these are people that need more variety. A lot of people that might describe themselves as ADHD. We hear, multitasking. That's a myth. But what we're doing is we're saying, okay, I'm going to do a 20 to 30 minute sprint, and I'm going to do this one particular task. I'm going to go into it using the sprint structure in the book. I'm going to articulate what I'm going to get done during this time. I'm going to set a timer. I'm going to get it done. And then I'm going to do something else. And so by doing that, then you get more done in that period of time. And we talk about how even a 1 minute break between tasks reduces vigilance decrement. Vigilance, how well you pay attention. Decrement meaning breaking down over time. So these boring tasks, you can still be as productive at the end of them if you just take a 1 minute break between tasks. So first we have those two things. Then we want to look at, when do you sprint? So I was an automated sprinter because every Thursday that was automatically in my calendar on repeat. It was blocked out. My assistant didn't put anything in that time. It just was on repeat every Thursday. Joe's writing. Right. Okay. So an automated sprinter puts it in, makes sure that just repeats over time. Whereas an intensive sprinter is someone that needs to go away to sprint. They may need to have a 2 or 3 day weekend at an Airbnb so that they're not looking at their laundry. They're not thinking about their home office. They're not worrying about their kids. So I think about Dr. Jeremy Sharp, who has the Testing Psychologist podcast. I talk about his approach in the book to being an intensive sprinter. So what he does is he gets an Airbnb in a different town from where he lives. So he drives and he allows his brain to kind of wander on the way there. He then finds an Airbnb that's close to vegan restaurants because he's vegan and he wants to be able to walk there. He looks at the menu ahead of time, so he's not doing any decision making while he's actually doing the sprint. He then walks to get some exercise. He then eats his vegan food, comes back. He wants to have an Airbnb that has an outdoor space for him to work because he knows if he goes back and forth between spaces, that can help him get more done. And then he's a task switcher. So he brings a lot of different types of work for those intensives. And so he might work on his books for part of the morning. He might work on, catching up on podcasts for the morning. He might vision out a content calendar for the year. So he's task switching. So when we start to figure out what type of sprinter we are, we can get more done. So I know through and through, I'm an automated sprinter. I need to have that repeat in my calendar. And I need to be a time block sprinter where I'm doing one thing for, say, 2 to 3 hours at a time, broken up into 20 to 30-minute sprints. That works best for my personality type, my sprint type. For you, Tyler, it might be completely different. But when we discover that, then instead of feeling like, oh, I'm not a sprinter, I can't batch, you actually get more done in that period of time.
Mm-hmm. No, I love it. I love, as you describing that, thinking of what I fall into and I have some ideas and thoughts, but I think it's something that needs to be practiced out. And I think these are all great examples for as leaders to help others, not only ourselves, but help others through this process, this trial and error process, which, I'm thankful, again, your book is talking about this because it's so paramount today as we see this massive fluctuation in workplace. We see this massive fluctuation in leadership style, which, then you throw on top of the generations, which is even more cosmic in all the different challenges. And so, Joe, man, I'm thankful that you came and joined us on the Impact Driven Leader podcast. I'm thankful for your relationship, our friendship, and I'm excited to be able to share this book even more with others. So thanks for your time, man.
Oh, Tyler, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so those of you that listening in, please check out all the information in the show notes to learn more about Joe and the book. Thursday is the new Friday. Can't wait, man. Great seeing you, and we'll talk again soon.
Thank you so much.
And stop.